Good morning. I'm going to be reading 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 10 from the New International Version. The Lord calls Samuel. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The word of God for the people of God. Amen.
After worship this morning, can you hear me all right? Yes? All right. It sounded different. So after worship this morning, we're finally having the reception to welcome the Shappas that we were supposed to have back in August when they joined the church, and I baptized little Elizabeth Ruth back there, and Hurricane Henri decided to postpone the after-church celebration. That Sunday, I preached about the covenant of baptism in particular, and about what covenants are in general. This week, I want to begin to pull on one of those other covenant threads to talk about calling and purpose. I'll hit the theme several times across this next month, so if you missed the sermon on the covenant of baptism, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, either directly or through the sermons page on the website, and watch it. It was on August 22nd. And remember from that covenants are the way that we recognize and welcome others into the various sets of families to which we belong. Marriage being the earliest covenant that we know of in human history. Covenants aren't contracts that begin and end when terms are met. They're meant to be permanent, which is why the marriage vows end till death do us part, even though we often part more frequently than that, including yours truly. But a covenant says, you weren't family before, but with this covenant, with its visible sign and the presence of witnesses, you are family now. Baptism, with its sign of water, brings people into the Christian family. The law of Moses, with its sign of keeping the Sabbath, brings people into the family of Israel. Both of them sit under the ark of the rainbow, which is the sign of the covenant in the story of Noah, which made all living things on the earth part of the family of God. That first biblical covenant with Noah in Genesis 9 covers everything that comes later. It's never superseded, and it remains the guiding principle for every subsequent covenant. God considers every living thing on the earth, human, animal, plant, the very earth itself, all of it, to be part of one family, the family of God. We can make more particular covenants within that frame that are specific to our own families, cultures, and religions. But if any of those smaller covenants stands in opposition to the understanding that the earth and all who dwell therein are joined with us as part of God's divine family, then we have broken the very heart of God, the fundamental understanding of what God has made, the calling and the purpose of creation itself. If we break that first covenant, we've broken them all, because God's adoption of all creation as beloved family is the foundational understanding for all of it. You know from my initial sermons here how important I think the earliest chapters of Genesis are. While I don't read them literally, and I would encourage you not to read them literally either, I do read them seriously, with the understanding that God is speaking through those authors to give us truth about God's dream for creation and for the mortals made in God's image. Those chapters are not trying to give us scientific or historical or other facts. Truth and facts are related, but they're ultimately different things. And when you can leave aside the questions about whether they're factual and read the origin stories of the Hebrew people through the much larger lens of truth, those stories will blow your socks off. It's in these ancient stories that we find the boundaries for evaluating whether God has called us to this thing or that, and whether something we're considering fits with God's purpose for our lives. We need those boundaries because it is a wild world out there when people start marching around saying God has called them to do whatever it is that they're doing at the moment. If you think that claim isn't used to manipulate people, well, God called me to sell you a bridge. So how do we sort all that out, either for ourselves or for the claims made by others? Jesus gives us an excellent measure by saying, "By their fruit you shall know them." But long before that, here in the prehistory of Israel, the lines for evaluating good and bad fruit are drawn. Genesis 1 tells us that humans are made in God's image and have dominion over the earth. Well, what does that mean exactly? Genesis 2 starts to explain it. In Genesis 1, humans are created last. But as the story goes in Genesis 2, God creates Adam there first, then creates everything else, and then tells Adam in verse 15 that his job is to serve and protect it all. So just like the covenant after the flood is the basis for understanding all other covenants, Genesis 2:15 is the basis for understanding all human vocation. At its most basic level, the calling of every human being begins with the service to and the protection of all the rest of creation. That vocation, that calling, given to Adam in Genesis 2:15, is the thing that is sealed for all time and all people in God's covenant with Noah in Genesis 9. It's introduced there, it's sealed, it's marked with the rainbow, the covenant is established, it's everybody. Every calling and every covenant have to meet that first basic threshold to be considered God's work. It must somehow further serving and protecting the earth and the family of all living things. When we blessed the ground on the first Sunday of this month, we acted out both that calling and that covenant. When we bless the animals on October 3rd, we will again act in accordance with both that calling and that covenant. When we accepted Ginny, Andrew, and Elizabeth Ruth Schappa into our church family at Crawford last month, we welcomed them with the understanding of our place within God's universal covenant and calling. The calling of God for you or for anyone else assumes that foundation. It's sort of the two-factor authentication of God's call. Serve and protect creation and treat all that lives within it as family. If it doesn't check out, let that call go to voicemail. It's a scammer. So, with that understanding complete at the end of Genesis 9, then the Bible's roster of characters literally explodes. That's when all the begets begin, and the age limit for when people die goes down from the 900s to what we would recognize as a normal human lifespan. And then all the characters start coming at us really fast. God calls all kinds of people with all kinds of work to be done, and not just people. God also calls 2 donkeys, a bunch of ravens, not to mention pressing 2 bodies of water and the sun itself into service. But the calling that captivated me as a child was the one about a child, the one you heard Kim read this morning, the story of Samuel. Samuel's mother was named Hannah, and her husband wasn't a leader or a priest or some special kind of dude. He was just a random guy in the Israelite tribe of Ephraim. Hannah was unable to have children, something that tore at her heart enough that she went to the temple at Shiloh to pray daily for a child. So this is before there is a temple in Jerusalem, and the Ark of the Covenant is moving around, and wherever the Ark is, that's where the temple is, and right then it's in Shiloh. And in her prayers, Hannah promises God that if she's given a son, she would apprentice him to a priest to work full-time for God. It was a certain vow called the Nazarites. We can talk about that at some other time. But her prayers were so intense, because she was so upset and so wanted a child, that the priest at Shiloh, Eli, thought she was drunk. And then he chews her out when she's praying. You know, you shouldn't come to the temple drunk, lady. When she explains that she's not in fact drunk, she's in distress over this prayer, Eli finally sees the picture, and then he tells her that God will grant her request. She does conceive, and Samuel is born. 1 Samuel chapter 2 is her prayer of praise for that gift, and it is often and usually and fairly compared to Mary's Magnificat to Elizabeth in the New Testament. But that great gift meant great sacrifice, because she'd made a promise. And true to her word, as soon as Samuel was weaned, somewhere between 3 to 5 years old, she gave him up. She gave him to Eli to serve God in the temple. She was allowed to see her son only once a year after that. So when young Samuel hears something in the middle of the night, he can't go to his mother or his father. His only guide is this priest, Eli, who was already best known for thinking his mother's desperate prayer was her showing up to the temple drunk. And it takes Eli a few tries here, too. Samuel keeps going back into Eli's room and waking him up. Someone called me. Did you call me? No. Go back to bed. Hi. Me again. Did you call me? Someone called me. No. I told you, go back to bed. Knock, knock. Here I am. Look, you definitely called me. Somebody called me. And finally, Eli gets it and recognizes that it's God, in fact, calling Samuel, and tells him how to respond when the call comes again, to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." I was mesmerized by this story as a child. God called Samuel by name, and God didn't give up until Samuel was able to understand who was calling and to respond. I cannot tell you how many nights I went to bed saying, "Speak, for your servant is listening," because I wanted to hear from God. I wanted that more than anything else in the world. I never heard that audible voice that Samuel heard, but by the time I was 14 and found myself standing in the pulpit of the North Scituate Baptist Church in Rhode Island to preach for Youth Sunday, I heard God in my heart confirming that this was how I was to serve for the rest of my life. to preach God's love as a member of the clergy. The downside of both my calling and Samuel's, though, is that when others try to listen for God's call in their own lives, they often assume that God's call is always to some form of explicitly religious service, because it's those of us in the religious professions that usually end up telling these stories. But that very first call to Adam in Genesis 2:15 is as broad as it is universal. Serve and protect creation. There are as many ways to do that as there are people on the planet. And no one way is better than another. Your way of answering whatever call you have is no better than my way of doing my thing or anybody else's. Every calling of God is holy by default. But calling isn't only or even primarily about what we do. Our initial calling is not to a job, but to a relationship with the one who made us. It's first a call to discipleship. Sometimes people have trouble discerning God's call for their lives because they're listening for a job to do instead of a person to become. I felt my call to ordained ministry when I was 14, but that by no means meant that I was ready to be deployed as a minister at age 14. I would have been a menace to the gospel. I would have been a menace to the gospel had I done it at 24. It took me to 35 before I began service in the church. I meant well, but I wasn't yet ready. Discerning that God is calling you to be like a doctor may be absolutely right, but it doesn't mean that you can safely perform heart surgery without adequate training. And we see that in the biblical characters too. Abraham was 75 years old when God called him. Moses was a murderer at age 40 and had to spend the next 40 years tending sheep out in the desert before God could use him at age 80 to stand before Pharaoh and liberate the Hebrew slaves. Paul was likely in his early to mid-20s when he was knocked off his horse on the road to Damascus and had a vision of God. But he had to spend the next 14 years back home in Tarsus unlearning all his old ways before God could send him on his first missionary journey. Even Jesus didn't begin his ministry until he was 30, and he only did so then because his mother insisted on more wine for some wedding guests. Young Samuel was actively working in the temple, but he hadn't yet learned to recognize God's voice. It would be many more years of learning to distinguish God's voice above the crowd before Samuel the child could become Samuel the prophet in the book that bears his name. But the real start of his journey was when he followed Eli's advice, went back to his room, heard the voice again, and said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." He answers the phone and says yes to the relationship, which is where it all begins for all of us and is the key thing that then allows us to begin to learn, this sounds like the God I know. This really doesn't sound like the God I know. If you haven't yet heard God's call in your life, it could be because you don't know what you're listening for. Or maybe you didn't even know God was calling in the first place. You thought all that ringing was just robocalls. Go find Eli. He might be a little slow on the uptake, but he gets it eventually. Talk to somebody who has some experience in hearing from God and learn the ways that God has spoken to them. You might be surprised at what you discover. Pretty soon, just like those who pay attention to birds learn to distinguish the call of the chickadee from the call of the cardinal, you'll find that messages from God are more plentiful than you thought. Now, we're going to be talking about calling and purpose and more of this at various points across the next month. So this isn't all. But my message for you this morning is just the simple news that God is calling you. It's not a factor of age or holiness or stage of life or health or anything else. God is calling everyone because everyone is part of God's family. We are in universal relationship, and there is a calling for every person, for every organization. There is a special calling for Crawford Memorial United Methodist Church and for every other church in this town. God is calling each of us by name. Can you hear it? Will you hear it? It's the call that will change your life, so you have to want that in order to hear it. We see that in the calling of the prophets throughout the Bible. They hear God's voice and say, no, wrong number. New phone, who dis? So the call of God will change every one of us. When we're ready for that, we're ready to listen. And when we're ready to listen and can say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening," then we're ready to hear. Stop, receive, listen. Amen.